Chapter 1. The Wolf at the Edge of the World. The bruise on Lena Voss's collarbone was the color of a dying storm. She caught a glimpse of it in the cracked bathroom mirror, a deep violet bloom spreading upward toward her throat, and quickly tugged the collar of her second-hand sweater over it before she could. Looking too long made it real, made it something that needed to be felt and named and explained. She had learned years ago that none of those things ever helped. Downstairs, her mother was quiet. That was almost worse than the noise. The quiet meant she was drinking again, which meant the house was holding its breath, which meant Lena needed to be somewhere else before the second glass became the third, and the third became a reason. She pulled on her coat, grabbed her canvas bag from the hook by the door, and stepped out into the November cold. Millhaven was the kind of small town that people described as charming if they visited for a weekend and suffocating if they had to stay. It sat in the crease of two low mountains, rimmed on its eastern edge by a forest so dense and dark that locals had given it a name, the Greywood. No one hiked in the Greywood after October. This was not a rule written anywhere. It was simply understood, the way all old things in small towns are understood, through absence of explanation, through silence passed down like an heirloom. Lena had grown up at the edge of that silence and never questioned it. She walked the long way to the diner where she worked the dinner shift, skirting the far end of Callaway Road where the pavement gave out and gravel took over, and the tree line began its slow crawl toward the sky. It was the route that added 12 minutes to her walk. She took it anyway because it was empty, and the cold air burned her lungs clean, and for 12 minutes she didn't have to be a daughter. She was almost at the bend in the road when she felt it. The feeling arrived before the awareness, the way fear always does. A sudden tightening at the base of her spine, a prickle along her arms beneath the coat. Her footsteps slowed without conscious instruction. Her breath came shallow. She turned. At the far edge of the road, where the gravel crumbled into dead grass, and the dead grass dissolved into shadow, a wolf was standing, not moving, not advancing, simply standing, with a stillness so absolute it didn't seem like a living thing so much as a monument to the idea of one. It was enormous. That was the first thing that struck her. Not the color of its fur, black as creek water at night, with a faint silver gleam along the ridge of its back, and not its eyes, pale, almost colorless, catching the last of the gray afternoon light, but its sheer size. It was the size of a problem that doesn't have a name yet, the size of something that shouldn't exist this close to town. It looked at her, not the way animals look at movement, tracking, categorizing, dismissing. This was something else. Something that settled over her like a question she didn't have the vocabulary to answer. She should have run. Every reasonable thing inside her knew that. She was alone on an empty road at dusk with a wolf between her and the tree line, and the nearest house was a quarter-mile back. And she should have run. She didn't. She stood very still and looked back at it and felt, underneath the fear and the cold and the ache along her collarbone, underneath all of it, something she had no name for, a hum at the back of her teeth. A warmth that shouldn't have been possible in November air. What are you? She thought. Not with alarm. With something closer to recognition. The wolf tilted its head, and then a truck came around the bend behind her, headlights sweeping the road wide and loud, and when Lena snapped her gaze back to the tree line, the wolf was gone. Not running, not retreating, simply gone, the way a thought goes when you reach too hard for it. She stood in the wash of the truck's passing light until the sound of its engine faded. Her heart was still loud in her ears. Her hands were trembling, but not from cold. She walked the rest of the way to the diner without looking back, which took more effort than she expected. The Millhaven diner smelled like coffee and old wood and the particular comfort of places that have not changed in 30 years. Lena tied on her apron, filled 4 orders, smiled at the regulars, and did not think about the wolf. She thought about the wolf the entire shift. Mara, the other evening waitress, caught her staring through the window at the dark street 3 separate times and said, "You look like someone walked over your grave." In the cheerful way Mara said most things that were accidentally correct. "Saw a wolf on Callaway Road," Lena said, because it was the only version of the truth she had. Mara set down a pot of decaf. A wolf. Big one. Black, just standing there. Mara was quiet for a beat too long. On Callaway? That's not far from the Greywood border. I know. Wolves don't come that close to town. I know. Mara picked the coffee pot back up and moved away down the counter, and Lena noticed, she would think about this later, would turn it over in the quiet of her walk home. That Mara didn't say you must have imagined it the way most people would have, didn't laugh, didn't offer a rational explanation, just moved away down the counter with her shoulders slightly raised, the way people move when a subject has an edge they don't want to brush against. She walked home after close under a sky that had gone full dark, stars hidden behind a layer of cloud that caught the town's pale light and gave it back diffuse and silver. The cold had deepened into something with weight behind it. She took the short route home. Callaway Road. She told herself it was because her feet hurt. She did not examine this explanation very closely. The road was empty, the tree line was dark. There was no wolf, but at the exact place where she had stood that afternoon, the dead grass on the road's edge was flattened in a wide oval, pressed down with purpose, still faintly warm when she crouched. Foolishly, her hand reaching out before her mind said, "Don't," and touched the ground. Warm. In November. As if something very large had lain there for a very long time. Watching. She stood up. She walked home. She said nothing to her mother, who was asleep on the couch with the television on, a glass tipped sideways on the floor, its contents long since soaked into the rug. Lena lay in bed that night with the lights off and her collar still pulled high over the bruise and listened to the forest that began somewhere beyond the edge of town. She thought she heard something at the very edge of hearing, low, resonant, too deep to be wind. She told herself it was wind. She did not sleep for a long time. Chapter 2. Something in the Marrow. The dreams began that night. Not violent dreams, not the kind Lena was used to. The ones where she was running through a house with too many hallways and every door she opened led back to her mother's face. These were different. These were slow and luminous and left residue on her skin when she woke. The way perfume clings to a coat long after the person wearing it has left the room. In the dream, she was standing in the graywood, not at its edge, not at the cautious periphery where town children sometimes dared each other in summer. She was deep in it. Deep enough that the canopy above her had knit itself closed, deep enough that the only light came from below, from the ground itself, which pulsed with a faint silver luminescence like veins of moonlight buried in the earth. She wasn't afraid. That was the detail that stayed with her after waking. She should have been afraid. She was alone in a forest that the whole town treated like a held breath, in the dark, with silver light bleeding up through the roots, and she felt, instead, the particular stillness of arriving somewhere after a very long journey. There were symbols on the trees. She noticed them the way you notice things in dreams, not by looking, but by suddenly knowing, the awareness arriving complete and whole. Carved into the bark of the old oaks, deep and deliberate, a circle with a single line bisecting it vertically, like a moon split in two. They ringed her on every side, dozens of them. Hundreds, maybe. She reached out and pressed her palm flat against the nearest one. The warmth that moved through her hand and up her arm was the same warmth she had felt on the road that afternoon, crouching over the flattened grass with her fingers against the cold ground. Identical, as though something had left a signature in both places, written in a frequency her body could read even when her mind couldn't. She turned. He was there. Not fully. Not in the way of the wolf from the road, concrete and enormous and undeniable. More like a suggestion. A tall shape, at the edge of the silver light, dark-haired, standing with the same absolute stillness the wolf had possessed. She could not see his face. The light didn't reach that far, but she had the overwhelming sense that he could see hers, and that he had been looking at it for longer than she knew. She opened her mouth. He stepped back into the dark and was gone. She woke to her alarm at 6:15 with her hand pressed flat against the cold wall beside her bed. Her mother was already in the kitchen when Lena came downstairs, which was unusual. She was standing at the counter with a mug of black coffee, still wearing last night's clothes. Her hair pulled back in the efficient way she wore it when she was in a punishing mood, when she wanted her face to be fully visible, weaponized. Lena moved through the kitchen without making eye contact. This was the choreography they had refined over years. Lena as moving target. Her mother as something that tracked motion but only struck if the motion came too close or too slow or too loud. Today she was too slow. "You came in late," her mother said. "I worked the close shift." Lena opened the cabinet for a glass. "I don't like you walking alone at night." "You don't like me," Lena thought. "The walking is incidental." "I'm 23, she said instead. The mug came down on the counter with a crack that wasn't quite a slam, but was meant to be heard as one. "While you're in my house, I'll be home by 10 tonight. She filled the glass, drank it, set it in the sink. kept her back straight. "I have the morning shift today and then the library until 4. A silence that had texture to it like static. Lena was already moving toward the door. Her mother's voice followed her. "I saw you didn't eat the dinner I left." There had been no dinner left. Lena had checked. But this was the other part of the choreography, the revision of facts, the gentle insistence on a reality that hadn't happened, the way her mother rebuilt the architecture of each day to position herself as the one who had been failed. "I ate at the diner," Lena said, and closed the door before the next sentence could form. The Millhaven Public Library was a narrow, 2-story building wedged between the hardware store and an insurance office, as if someone had decided books deserved the smallest possible apology for existing. Inside, it smelled like dust and radiator heat, and the particular silence of a place where people came to be alone together. Lena worked the reference desk on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, $4 over minimum wage, shelving and helping the occasional patron navigate the catalog. She had worked there since she was 19. She loved it in the uncomplicated way she had learned to love small, reliable things, the order of the stacks, the specific sound of a spine opening for the first time, the way the old librarian, Mr. Jennis Cutler, brought her tea without being asked. Today she found herself in the local history section. She wasn't sure how she got there exactly. She'd been shelving returns in the nature section, and the next thing she was aware of was standing in front of a shelf labeled Millhaven and surrounding region. History, folklore, legend, with 3 books already pulled and open on the table beside her. She sat down. The first book was a regional history from 1973, the kind with black and white photographs and very small type. She flipped through it with the slightly dizzy feeling of someone following a thread without knowing where it leads. Town founding, logging industry, agricultural records. And then, tucked into a chapter about the land disputes of the late 1800s, a single paragraph that made her stop. The Greywood was considered sovereign territory by the indigenous communities of the region long before European settlement, and retained a ceremonial significance that early settlers recorded with unease. Several accounts from the period describe unusual markings on the trees, circular symbols, consistently described as a moon divided, which the settlers were warned not to touch or deface. The source and meaning of these markings was never formally documented. Lena sat very still. A moon divided. She closed the book, opened the second, a slimmer volume, self-published, with a hand-typed index, local ghost stories and strange accounts. She almost set it aside before a chapter heading caught her eye. The Pale-Eyed Watchers, Recurring Reports from the Greywood Border, 1920 present. Her mouth had gone dry. She looked up at the library around her, the empty afternoon light falling in dusty columns through the windows, the distant sound of Mr. Pand, Cutler's radio at the front desk, the absolute ordinariness of everything, and felt it again, the hum. Low and resonant, at the back of her teeth. She was being watched. She turned slowly, the way you move when you already know what you're going to see and are giving yourself a moment's grace before you have to accept it. Across the library, at the far end of the stacks, a man stood with one hand resting on a shelf and his eyes on her. Tall, dark-haired, still in the way that stopped time. She recognized the stillness before she could possibly have recognized anything else. He didn't look away when she caught him looking. He didn't startle or shift or perform the small social apology of a person caught staring. He simply held her gaze with pale eyes, nearly colorless, catching the library's thin afternoon light, and the temperature in the room dropped 2 degrees, or she imagined it did, and her heart made a sound against her ribs like a fist on a locked door. He turned and walked toward the exit. Wait, the word left her before she decided to say it. He didn't stop, but at the door, for just one fraction of a second, she saw his head tilt. Barely, almost nothing, the same precise angle as the wolf on the road. The door closed behind him. Lena sat in the quiet library with 3 books about the Greywood open in front of her and the hum still alive in her teeth, and understood. In the wordless way, the body understands things before the mind will allow them, that something had already begun. She just didn't know yet what it would cost her. Chapter 3. The Weight of a Name. She went after him. She would question this decision later, turning it over in the quiet of her room like a stone with something living underneath it. She was not, by nature, a person who chased things. She had spent most of her 23 years perfecting the opposite, the art of stillness, of making herself small and undetectable, of waiting out storms rather than walking toward them. Her mother had taught her that, in the brutal pedagogical way her mother taught everything, but her body was already moving before her mind filed its objection, and by the time she pushed through the library door and into the cold afternoon air, she had already committed to the impulse, and there was nothing left to do but follow it through. The street was quiet in the way Millhaven streets went quiet in November, a hibernating quiet, the town pulling itself inward. A woman walking a dog on the far side of the road, a truck idling outside the hardware store, the smell of wood smoke coming from somewhere up the hill, and there, at the far end of the block, walking with the unhurried certainty of someone who knew exactly where he was going and had calculated that no one would follow him. She followed. He turned left at the end of the block, away from the center of town, toward the older neighborhoods where the houses sat farther apart, and the trees were taller, and the streets still had names like Wren Lane and Birchwood Close. Lena kept half a block behind him, which felt both too close and, absurdly, not close enough. She kept expecting him to disappear, to step between two houses and simply be gone the way he had been gone from the library doorway before she'd even processed that he'd left. He didn't disappear. He stopped. In front of a house on Birchwood Close, a wide two-story with a stone foundation and dark painted shutters and the particular look of a place that was being inhabited rather than lived in, occupied without warmth. He stopped on the front path and turned around. He had known she was there the entire time. Of course he had. Lena stopped walking. They were 20 feet apart. The late afternoon light sat on the street between them like something that couldn't decide which way to fall. Up close. And this was close. Closer than the library's long sightline had allowed. He was younger than she expected. Early 30s maybe. Sharp-featured without being severe. Dark hair, slightly too long, pushed back from his face with the absent-minded practicality of someone who had stopped caring about that particular detail. He was wearing a coat that was too light for the weather, which she noticed in the distracted way you notice small, wrong things about people you are trying not to stare at. His eyes were exactly the color she remembered. Pale gray, almost silver. The color of ice on a river before it breaks. He looked at her the way the wolf had looked at her. Not tracking, not categorizing. Something slower and more thorough than that. Something that felt less like being seen and more like being read. "You followed me," he said. His voice was low and unhurried, each word placed with care. Not an accusation, more like a fact being entered into a record. "You were watching me," she said. "In the library." And before that, she held his gaze because looking away felt like a concession she wasn't willing to make. On Callaway Road, a silence. The wind moved through the tall trees along the street, and the last of the daylight shifted. "You shouldn't have followed me," he said. "Probably not." She crossed her arms against the cold. Her voice was steadier than she felt. "Who are you?" He looked at her for a moment longer, that deliberate, measuring look, and she had the distinct sensation of a decision being made just behind his eyes. Some internal scale tipping a fraction of a degree. "See," Keelty said. Just the one word, offered like something he wasn't sure he should give. "Kay," she repeated. "Do you have a last name?" "Not one I use here." She waited. He didn't add anything. The wind came through again, and she pulled her coat tighter and noticed, in the silence, that he hadn't moved once. Not a shift of weight, not a reach to his collar against the cold, not the small involuntary adjustments that living bodies constantly make. He stood as if stillness was his natural state and movement was the thing that required effort. "You were looking at me in that library like you knew me," she said. "I don't know you. Then why? I needed to see you." He said it flatly without inflection, as though this were a reasonable and complete answer. It was not a reasonable and complete answer. That's not an explanation. "No," he agreed. "It isn't." She studied him. Something in her chest was doing the thing it had been doing since the road, that low, persistent hum, like a string that had been plucked and refused to stop vibrating. It was more pronounced now. Standing this close to him, it was almost audible, almost a sound rather than a sensation. And she had the irrational and alarming thought that if she reached out and pressed her hand to his chest, she would feel it resonating there too. She kept her hands where they were. "Do you live here?" she asked, meaning the house. "Temporarily." "How long have you been in Millhaven?" He tilted his head slightly. It was the same fractional tilt she had catalogued twice before, and up close it did something to her composure that she immediately worked to correct. "Long enough," he said. "Long enough for what?" This time the silence went on longer. He looked at her with those pale, impossible eyes, and something moved through his expression. Not quite discomfort, not quite regret. Something older than both. Something that reminded her, absurdly, of the symbol she had read about in the library. Carved deep, deliberate, carrying a meaning that had survived long past the people who made it. "You've been dreaming about the forest," he said. The cold air went very still. Every self-protective instinct Lena possessed lit up simultaneously, the ones honed over years of navigating her mother's unpredictable terrain, the ones that said back away, go slow. Don't let anyone know what's underneath. She had not told anyone about the dreams. She had not written them down. They had occurred inside the privacy of her own sleeping mind, witnessed by no one. "How do you know that?" she said. Her voice came out quieter than she intended. He looked at her, and for the first time she saw something in his face that wasn't calculation and wasn't distance. Something that looked uncomfortably close to sorrow. "Because I was there," he said. The words landed in the space between them, and neither of them moved, and the wind had gone entirely still now, the street silent. The town around them holding itself with the same suspended breath as the graywood on its eastern edge. Lena's heart was very loud in her ears. "What does that mean?" she asked. "It means—" He stopped, looked away from her for the first time, toward the dark line of trees visible at the end of the street. Something moved through the line of his jaw. "It means you should go home, Lena." Her name. He had said her name without her telling it to him. She should have run. The reasonable parts of her were filing loud, urgent reports on this point. She took one step forward instead. "Tell me what's happening," she said, quietly. Not a demand. Something more naked than a demand. "Please." He turned back, looked at her with that pale gaze that didn't track or dismiss but simply held. And she felt the hum in her teeth crescendo for just a moment. Just one long, suspended moment, into something almost warm. "Not here," he said finally. "Not tonight." He glanced at the fading light. "Go home before dark. Take the short route. And tomorrow?" Another pause. Another small internal scale tipping in a direction she couldn't see. "Tomorrow," he said. "I'll find you." He turned and walked up the path to the dark house, and she stood on the cold street with his name in her mouth like something that had always lived there and just now been discovered. And she understood, fully and without comfort, that nothing about her life was going to look the same from this side of this moment. She turned and walked home. Short route. She did not take her eyes off the tree line until she couldn't see it anymore. Chapter 4. What the town remembers he didn't find her the next day. She waited. Not consciously. Not in the way of someone standing at a window watching the road. In the way of someone going about the ordinary mechanics of a day while a second, quieter self remains perpetually oriented toward a door that hasn't opened yet. She worked the morning shift at the diner. She shelved books at the library. She walked home through the early dark with her collar up and her eyes doing a thing she couldn't quite control. Sweeping the tree line at the end of every street, checking the shadows between buildings with a thoroughness she told herself was caution and knew was something else entirely. He didn't come. The house was mercifully quiet when she got home. Her mother had gone to her sister's in the next town over, a trip that happened 2 or 3 times a year, and that Lena had learned to receive the way you receive unexpected sunshine in a bad season, gratefully, without trusting it, already calculating when it would end. She ate toast standing at the counter. She didn't turn on the television. The silence of an empty house was a different quality of silence than the silence of a house with her mother in it. Softer, with more oxygen in it, and she had learned to inhabit it carefully. The way you move through a room where something fragile has been set on every surface. She took the books from her bag. The ones from the library's local history section. She had checked them out properly, signed her name in the catalog system, carried them home in the bottom of her bag beneath her work apron, with the slightly guilty feeling of someone transporting something mildly contraband. She spread them on the kitchen table and began to read. By midnight, she had filled 4 pages of a notebook. The symbols, the bisected circle, the divided moon, appeared in multiple sources, each account arriving at the image from a different direction, the way separate rivers arrive at the same sea. The 1973 Regional History, a pamphlet from a 1940s local historical society. A photocopied collection of settler journals assembled by a community college professor in 1998. The accounts agreed on the essentials. The markings predated European settlement by centuries. They were found exclusively within the Greywood and along its border. They were always carved at a consistent height, roughly chest level on an adult. And they were, according to every source that mentioned them, Always warm to the touch, regardless of season or temperature. Warm, she had written in her notebook and underlined it twice. The settler journals were the most detailed and the most disturbing. One entry, dated November 1887 and written by a man named Aldrich Voss, she had stopped when she saw the surname, her own surname. The coincidence sitting in her chest like a swallowed stone. Described an encounter at the Grey Wood's edge. Woke before dawn to the sound of something moving in the trees. Not the sound of an animal. The sound of a very large, very deliberate thing that did not wish to be heard, but had not quite managed it. Through the window I saw a shape at the forest's edge. Enormous. Dark. It was looking at the house. At dawn it was gone, but I found the grass outside the door pressed flat and still warm. And on the oak at the property's edge the circle mark had appeared overnight where there had been nothing the day before. Lena closed the journal. Outside, the wind was moving through the bare trees that lined the property, and the house made its nighttime sounds, the pop of cooling pipes, the shift of old wood, and she sat at the kitchen table with her grandmother's surname in a 100-year-old journal and understood, with a cold and clarifying certainty, that whatever was happening to her had been happening to women in her family for a very long time. She went to find him in the morning. She knew where he was staying, Birchwood Close, the grey house with the stone foundation and the dark shutters. She had told herself, walking there, that she was going because she deserved answers and he had promised to find her and hadn't, and the transference of initiative was entirely reasonable under the circumstances. These were all true things. They were not the whole truth. She knocked. 3 clean knocks, the kind that don't apologize for themselves. The door opened, and he was there, and for a fractional moment before his expression reassembled itself into its customary careful distance, she saw something move across his face, relief, or its near neighbor, and then it was gone and he was just standing in the doorway looking at her with those silver eyes that gave nothing away. "You didn't come," she said. "No. You said you would." "I know." He stepped back from the door, not quite an invitation. Not a refusal either. "Come in." The inside of the house was sparse in the way of places where someone has been staying rather than living. A jacket on a hook, a single mug on the kitchen counter, furniture that had come with the house arranged without personal preference, no photographs, no accumulated objects, nothing that said a person lives here beyond the bare minimum evidence of occupation. She stood in the front room and turned to face him. He had stopped a deliberate distance away, she noticed. Not the distance of social convention, something more purposeful. As though proximity was a variable he was actively managing. "I found something last night," she said. "In the library books." He waited. She told him about the symbols, about the settler journals, about the name, Aldrich Voss, her own surname, a century back. She watched his face as she spoke and saw, again, that thing she had seen on the street, the expression that lived just behind his careful distance, older than his face, heavier than his silence. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "I know about the journals," he said. "How?" A pause that lasted precisely long enough to be a choice. "Because I was there when he wrote them." The room went very still. Lena looked at him, really looked, the way she hadn't allowed herself to fully do before, taking inventory with the honest part of her mind rather than the cautious part. The face that was younger than she'd expected. The coat too light for November. The stillness that wasn't discipline or composure, but something structural, something that went all the way down. "That was 1887, she said. "Yes." The word dropped into the silence between them and sank. "That's not possible," she said, because she was still in some diminishing partition of herself, a person who lived in a world where that sentence was a complete argument. "There are things about this town," he said carefully, "the way you carry something that can break. And about your family's connection to it, that are older than any record you'll find in that library." He looked at her steadily. "And there are things about me that I cannot explain to you yet. Not safely." "Not safely for who?" He said nothing. "For me?" she pressed. "Or for you?" His jaw tightened, the first involuntary thing she had seen from him. "Both," he said quietly. And there it was, the fracture she had been sensing since the road, since the library, since the first moment his pale eyes had found hers across a distance that should have been safe. Not a lie exactly, but the shape of withheld truth, and she had grown up in a house full of withheld truths and knew their texture from the inside. She had trusted this pull in her chest, this inexplicable gravity. She had followed a stranger through cold streets. She had let his voice saying her name sit in her like something warm. And now he was standing 6 careful feet away telling her there were things he wouldn't say, and the bruise on her collarbone was still yellow at its edges. And she was a woman who had spent her whole life being kept outside the truth of things by people who claimed it was for her protection. "I need you to tell me the truth," she said. "All of it, not when it's safe now." He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his expression shifted, not softening exactly, but reorganizing around a new weight. "If I tell you," he said, "you can't unknow it. I'm already inside it," she said. "Whatever it is, I'd been inside it my whole life, I think." Outside the window, the sky was the pale gray of midwinter mornings, and the bare trees stood very still, and somewhere at the edge of town, the graywood waited with its symbols and its warmth, and its century-long patience. Cale looked at her, and for the first time, the distance between them felt less like a wall and more like a door. "Sit down," he said quietly. "This will take a while." Chapter 5. The language of old bones. She sat, not on the couch, on the chair nearest the door, which she recognized with distant self-awareness as a choice her body made independently of her mind. Old habit. Her mother's house had taught her to always know where the exit was. Cale noticed. She could tell by the way he didn't comment on it. He sat across from her, not close, still managing that deliberate distance, and rested his forearms on his knees, and looked at the middle space between them for a moment. The way people look when they are deciding not which truth to tell, but which truth to tell first. "Your family has a name," he said. "Among my people. The Voss women. There's a word for it in the old language, Morkai, roughly translated as those who carry the thread. It means your bloodline has been intertwined with ours for longer than either side fully remembers." Lena kept her hand still in her lap. "Your people," she said. He looked up at her. Held the look. "Say it," she said. "Shifters," he said. "Wolfkin, the pack that has held the Greywood territory since before this town had a name." He paused. "Before this country had a name." The word shifters landed in the room with a weight that was almost physical. Lena turned it over, examined it, felt the place in her chest where it should have produced disbelief, and found instead something more unsettling. A faint, terrible recognition, like hearing a word in a foreign language and understanding it before you have been taught it. "The wolf on the road," she said. "Yes. That was you. Yes." That she was absorbed this. Outside a car passed on the street, ordinary and loud, and the ordinary world pressed briefly against the window like a face of the glass and then receded. "You've been watching me," she said, "for 3 weeks. Why?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because the moon binding began showing signs and I needed to verify the lineage before I—" He stopped, reorganized. "There is a ritual, ancient. It was enacted between my pack and a woman of your bloodline 7 generations back. A binding between the Voss line and the Greywood pack, sealed at the full moon, renewed with every generation." His voice was careful and even, the voice of someone reciting something they have rehearsed, but cannot make sound rehearsed enough. "It grants the pack's sovereignty over this territory, protection of the land, the town, the boundary between our world and yours. In exchange, the Voss woman of each generation serves as the Morkai, the anchor, the human thread that keeps the binding from unraveling." Lena stared at him. "The anchor," she repeated. "A living connection between the human world and pack law. A witness." He seemed to search for the word. "A guarantor. The binding doesn't hold without one. And what does being the anchor require?" Something moved through his expression. "Awareness," he said. "Presence. A formal acknowledgement of the bond." He met her eyes. "And proximity to the alpha." The room was very quiet. "To you," she said. He didn't answer, which was an answer. Lena stood up, not to leave, or not yet, but because the chair was suddenly insufficient for the size of what was being placed inside her. She moved to the window, put her back to him, looked out at the ordinary gray street with its bare trees and its parked cars and its complete indifference to the conversation happening on the other side of the glass. 7 generations, she said. "So every woman in my family before me knew." "Yes, or most of them." "The knowledge was passed down through your maternal line." "My mother," Lena said. The word came out flat. "Your mother knew," Cael said. His voice had shifted, something careful entering it that hadn't been there before. She broke the succession, refused the acknowledgement. It's why the binding has been deteriorating for the past 20 years, why the Greywood's boundary has been weakening. Why? He stopped again. She turned from the window. Why what? Why rogue elements have been testing the border, he said. Other packs, older things. The binding was never just administrative, Lena. It holds something back, something that was sealed inside the Greywood's deepest territory a very long time ago. As long as the bond holds, it stays sealed. The temperature in the room felt lower than it had when she came in. She thought of her mother, the way she drank, the way she raged, the way she broke things and then rebuilt them wrong and offered the wrong versions as though they were better than nothing. She had never, not once, considered that her mother's damage might have a shape older than her own childhood, a source outside herself. She wasn't sure if this made her feel better or worse. She knew, Lena said again, testing it, and she chose. She was afraid, Cale said, not defending, not judging either, simply stating a fact with the neutrality of someone who has had a long time to arrive at it. The acknowledgement requires a woman to step fully into a world that is not entirely human. Some women in your line embraced it. Some found it difficult. And you've been watching me for 3 weeks, Lena said, trying to decide if I'm going to be afraid like she was. He looked at her steadily, trying to decide if it was safe to approach you, because of the rogue packs. Partly. And the other part? A long silence. The wind moved through the trees outside and the house made its sounds, and somewhere at the edge of hearing, she was almost certain of it now, she was not imagining it, something resonated. Low and deep. Not threat, not quite comfort, because the Morkai bond, when it passes to a new generation, begins before the acknowledgement, he said quietly. It announces itself, in ways the woman feels whether she understands them or not. He held her gaze, and his voice came lower and more careful than before, carrying the weight of a truth he had been building toward for weeks. I can feel your emotions, Lena. Faintly, imprecisely. As they intensify. He paused. I felt you on that road before I saw you. I have felt you in your house. Not often, not clearly, but the extremes come through. The extremes. She stood very still as the implication of this assembled itself fully, as she thought of everything the extremes of her life in that house might have broadcast into whatever frequency connected her to this man. Fear, pain, the specific exhaustion of someone who has been surviving rather than living. The particular grief of a body that has been told for 23 years that it does not deserve to take up space. All of it, transmitted, received. How long, she said. Her voice had gone very quiet. Since you were 18, he said, when the bond first activated. He looked at her and his face, that careful, controlled face, had something in it now that she had no precedent for reading in the people who had made up her world. It was not pity. Pity had a downward angle to it. A distance. This was level. This was the look of someone standing in the same water. I'm sorry, he said, for what you've carried, for what I could feel and couldn't. Something moved in his jaw. Couldn't reach. Lena turned back to the window so he wouldn't see what that did to her face. Outside, the pale sky had deepened toward afternoon. The Greywood was not visible from this window, but she felt its direction the way you feel the direction of a sound, even when the sound has stopped. What happens, she said, if I don't acknowledge the bond? The binding continues to deteriorate. A pause. Within one more lunar cycle, it will fail entirely. And then what's inside the Greywood will no longer be inside it. She pressed her fingertips against the cold window pane and thought. About 7 generations of women who had stood at this same edge, this same threshold between the known world and the one underneath it, and had each made their choice. Her mother had chosen fear. Lena was trying to decide what she would choose. You said there were rogue elements testing the border, she said. Yes. Have they come close? Last night, he said, they crossed it. She turned from the window. His face told her the rest before he said it. They know about you, he said. They know the Morkai line is unacknowledged. They will try to use that. The fear arrived then, clean and cold and sharpening. The useful kind of fear that focuses rather than freezes. Then we don't have a lunar cycle, she said. No, he said, we don't. Chapter 6. What the moon reveals, she asked to see it. She wasn't sure what made her say it, whether it was the cold pragmatism of someone who needed to stop operating on inference and start operating on evidence, or whether it was something older and less rational than that, the pull in her chest that had been building since Calloway Road, tightening with each hour she spent in his orbit, until it had become less a feeling and more a gravitational fact. "If I'm going to make a decision about any of this," she said, standing at his window with the pale afternoon light behind her, "I need to see it. All of it. Not descriptions. Not history lessons." She met his eyes. "Show me what you are." He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his expression moved through several registers she couldn't fully name before settling into something that was not quite resignation and not quite relief. "Tonight," he said, "at the Greywood border, after dark." "Why after dark?" "Because what I need to show you isn't only me." She went home first. Her mother was back. The car was in the drive. The light was on in the kitchen. And Lena moved through the house with the practiced efficiency of someone navigating a weather system, checking its pressure, adjusting accordingly. Her mother was in a quiet mood, which meant a fragile mood, which meant the evening required careful handling rather than bracing. They ate dinner at the kitchen table without speaking much. Her mother asked about the library. Lena answered in the careful, abbreviated way she had developed over years, enough detail to satisfy, not enough to invite. Her mother poured a second glass of wine and looked at Lena across the table with an expression Lena had never been able to fully decode, one that sat somewhere between guilt and resentment in the complicated territory where those two things blur together. "You're going out tonight," her mother said. "Not a question. For a walk, in the dark." "I'm 23, Lena said gently this time. Her mother looked at her wineglass. Something moved across her face, that same old architecture of withheld things, and Lena thought of what Cale had told her. She knew, and she was afraid. She looked at her mother's hands around the glass and tried, for a moment, to imagine the weight of knowing what her mother knew and choosing to carry it alone and drink around it for 20 years, and found she could almost arrive at something adjacent to understanding. "Be careful in the dark," her mother said finally. Her voice was strange, stripped of its usual edges. Lena looked at her. "I will," she said. She left at 9. Cale was waiting at the end of Calloway Road where the gravel gave out. He was standing with his hands in his coat pockets and his face turned toward the tree line. And he looked, in the darkness, like a man standing at the edge of something he had stood at the edge of many times and had not grown comfortable with. He turned when he heard her footsteps. Something in the line of his shoulders changed when he saw her. A small release, the adjustment of something held tightly for too long. "You came," he said. "I said I would." He looked at her for a moment, and in the dark his pale eyes were almost luminous, catching some quality of the moonless night that made them glow faintly silver. He turned without another word and walked into the Greywood. She followed. The forest closed around them immediately, not threateningly. There was nothing grasping or hostile about its darkness, but completely, the way a sentence closes around a word and gives it its full meaning. The noise of the town fell away within 20 steps. Within 50, the only sounds were their footsteps on the frozen ground and the high distant creak of bare branches, and beneath all of it, subtle and persistent, the low resonance she had been hearing at the edge of perception for days. "You can hear it," he said, not turning. He had heard her breath change. "Yes, that's the binding," he said. "What it sounds like when it's fraying. Healthy it would be." He paused, quieter, more like a heartbeat, and less like a fraying rope, she said. "Yes." They walked deeper. The trees here were enormous, old growth, the kind that had been standing for centuries, their trunks wider than she could have embraced with both arms. And there, on the bark of every third or fourth tree, visible even in the darkness, because they faintly luminescent exactly as in her dream, the symbols. The bisected circle, the divided moon. She stopped at one and raised her hand. Looked back at him. "Go ahead," he said. She pressed her palm flat against the symbol. The warmth moved up her arm the way it had in the dream. The same warmth, identical, temperature and texture both. But awake, it was more complex. In the dream, it had been simple heat. Here it was layered. She could feel within it something that was almost sound and almost emotion, a frequency carrying information she didn't yet have the vocabulary to read. She felt age in it, patience. And underneath those, something urgent, something sending up its signal like a fire lit on a hill. She dropped her hand, turned to Cale, who was watching her with an expression that had gone carefully neutral over something that was not. "You felt it differently than before," he said. "How do you know? Your face." She let this pass. What did I feel? The binding recognizing you, he said. Your bloodline activating something that has been dormant. He paused. For 20 years. She looked at the symbol a moment longer, then turned to face him fully. You said you'd show me. He held her gaze. Then he stepped back, creating a space between them, and for a moment he was simply still, that profound architectural stillness. And then the stillness itself seemed to shift, to reorganize, to become the stillness of a different kind of body. The change was not what she expected. She had expected violence, the cinematic tearing of a transformation, something that looked like pain. What she witnessed instead was something closer to water moving between states, a fluidity, a deepening. The man before her didn't disappear and a wolf appear in his place. Rather, one existence folded into the other, the human form releasing its shape the way a held breath releases. And in the space between one heartbeat and the next, the wolf stood where Kale had stood, enormous, black-furred with that faint silver ridge along its back, his eyes pale and nearly colorless, looking at her with the exact same quality of attention they had always held. She stood very still and let herself feel what was actually happening in her body, rather than what she expected to happen. Her pulse was elevated, her breath had shallowed, but underneath those physiological responses, underneath the entirely reasonable biological alarm of standing 6 feet from a wolf the size of a small vehicle, the hum had quieted, not stopped. Quieted, as if something that had been searching had found its frequency at last and could finally rest in it. She took a step forward. He held his ground and let her come, which she understood cost him something, the restraint visible in the absolute precision of his stillness, and she stopped when she was close enough to feel the heat radiating from him, which was extraordinary, the warmth of a living fire, and she raised her hand and waited. He lowered his enormous head. Her palm met the fur between his eyes. The warmth that moved through her was nothing like the symbol on the tree. That had been old and layered and complex. This was immediate and simple and devastating in its simplicity. The feeling of a door she had been pressing against her entire life swinging open from the other side. She stood in the graywood with her hand on the head of an ancient alpha wolf and felt, for the first time in 23 years of living in rooms that required her to be smaller than she was, exactly the size she actually was. She didn't hear the sound from deeper in the forest until it was close. It was not resonant, not warm. It was sharp and percussive, the sound of something moving fast through undergrowth with no concern for concealment, and it came from 3 directions simultaneously. And the wolf beneath her hand went rigid and his head came up and a sound built in his chest that she felt through her palm before she heard it. A warning, low and enormous and old as the trees themselves. "Run," he said, and she startled because the voice that came from him was still his voice, still that low, unhurried weight, emerging from a form that shouldn't have been able to produce it. "Back to the border, now." "What is it, now, Lena?" She ran. Behind her, the graywood erupted with sound, movement, collision, that warning becoming something else entirely, and she ran toward the faint pale glow of the town's light at the forest's edge, with her heart enormous in her chest, and the symbol's warmth still alive in her palm, and the understanding arriving, clear and complete, that whatever was sealed in this forest had begun, already, to push back. Chapter 7. The cost of kept things. She made it to the border. The tree line released her onto the gravel of Callaway Road, and she stumbled into the open air with her lungs burning and the town's pale light washing over her, and she turned immediately, instinctively, back toward the darkness she had come from. The forest was loud behind her, not with the sounds she associated with animals. Not rustling or calling, nothing that fit inside the categories of the natural world she had grown up adjacent to. These were sounds with weight and intention behind them. Collision, impact, a low sustained vocalization that moved through the frozen ground and up through the soles of her feet and into her chest, where it resonated against the hum that was now no longer low and searching, but high and urgent and afraid. She stood at the border and waited. She told herself she was waiting to make sure he was all right. She did not examine the intensity of this concern very carefully. 4 minutes, maybe 5. The sounds deepened, then subsided, then went entirely silent in the way that forests go silent after something decisive has happened. Not the silence of nothing occurring, but the silence of something having just concluded. He came out of the tree line 2 minutes after the silence fell. In human form, his coat was gone. There was a cut along his jaw that was already closing as she watched, the skin drawing together with a speed that made her stomach tilt sideways. His pale eyes found her immediately, and something in his expression, relief and anger arriving simultaneously, as though they were the same feeling, rearranged itself into something more controlled before it fully formed. "I told you to go home," he said. "I went to the border." "That isn't." He stopped, looked at the cut on his hand, which had already sealed itself shut, looked back at her. "Are you hurt?" "No." She watched the last trace of the cut on his jaw disappear entirely. "You're healing." "Yes." "That fast?" "Yes." She absorbed this the way she had been absorbing everything he gave her tonight, directly, without flinching, filing it into the part of her that was building a new architecture of the world on the fly. She was discovering, a person who broke under revelation. She was a person who reorganized around it. Her mother had perhaps not expected this in a daughter she had tried to keep deliberately small. "What were they?" she asked. "Rogue pack." His voice had gone flat and informational. 3 of them. Testing. Not a full assault. They weren't trying to take territory tonight. They were trying to locate something. Me. He didn't answer. Topple. She used his name deliberately, the way you use a key. Were they trying to locate me? A pause that was its own answer. They know the Morkai line has been unacknowledged. They know you exist. Tonight was reconnaissance. He looked toward the forest. It won't be the last. She stood in the cold road and felt the shape of what she was inside. Not a person anymore. Or not only a person. An anchor. A thread. A target with ancient writing on her back that she'd been carrying her whole life without knowing it was there. She started walking toward town. "Lena, I need to think," she said without turning. "I'm not leaving. I just need to walk." He fell into step beside her, which she had not exactly invited and did not exactly object to. They walked in silence for a full block before she said it. "How long have you been in Millhaven?" "I told you. Long enough." "Before 3 weeks," she said. "Have you been here before? Watching this family? Watching me?" A pause she had learned to read. The pause before a truth he had been deciding whether to offer. "Yes," he said. She kept walking. "How many times?" 4, he said. "Over the past 12 years. She stopped, turned to look at him on the dark street with the town's amber lights between them and everything she had just learned in the forest still live in her hands. 12 years, she said. "I was 11. I wasn't watching you then." His voice was careful. "I was watching the boundary, monitoring the deterioration, trying to determine whether your mother would change her position, a beat. She didn't. But you watched me grow up," she said, not an accusation. She was sorting through it in real time, turning it to examine every side. "You felt whatever I felt, for 12 years. Not consistently. The bond was too degraded. Extremes only. And I was not always." He paused. "I kept my distance deliberately, feeling someone's pain without being able to." The line of his jaw tightened. It seemed worse to be close. She looked at him for a long moment, at the controlled face with its careful architecture, its deliberate distance, all the evidence of a man, a being, who had spent a very long time managing the gap between what he could perceive and what he could affect. She thought about being 11, 12, 15. About the specific quality of the silence in her mother's house in the hours before something broke. About feeling, occasionally, a strange warmth she had always attributed to sunlight, or the heat vent in her room, or the particular mercy of exhaustion, arriving precisely when things were worst. "That was you," she said quietly. "Sometimes, when things were bad." He said nothing. "You pushed warmth through it," she said. "Through the bond. When it was bad enough." Still nothing, but the line of his jaw had changed. "That's why you said you're sorry," she said, "not just for watching, for not being able to do more." He turned to look at her, and for the first time she saw what he had been keeping most carefully behind his pale eyes. Not secrets, not information, but something raw and structurally important. The thing a dam is built to contain, and that the dam was, it turned out, insufficient for. "I should have come sooner," he said. "It came out stripped, the rehearsal gone from it. I kept calculating, kept measuring what was safe, what the bond required versus what approaching too early would risk." His voice was low and steady, but it was carrying weight she could hear in every word. "I heard things through it, Lena. Not words. Sensation. I know what your life has been." The street was very quiet around them. "And," she said, "and I waited too long. I knew that. I have known it." He held her gaze, and his face was not controlled anymore, not precisely. That is not something I can undo. She stood in the amber streetlight with 12 years of someone quietly witnessing her worst moments from an unbridgeable distance, and felt the thing she had been bracing against since the library, the fracture, the place where what he had given her and what he had withheld pulled against each other, and something gave way. You watched me for 12 years, she said, and never once knocked on the door. No. And the entire time you knew what was happening inside that house. Yes. Her voice, when it came, was not loud. Quiet things can carry further than loud ones. How many times, she said, do you think it would have been enough? Knowing someone was there, even at a distance, even through a frequency I couldn't name. She stopped, pressed her fingers briefly against her own sternum, against the hum. Once would have been enough. Do you understand that? One time, someone knocking on the door and saying, I know what's happening here, and you are not invisible. She stopped again. He was looking at her with an expression that had no defense left in it. I understand, he said. 2 words carrying the weight of 12 years. She turned and started walking again. He didn't follow immediately this time, and she was grateful because she needed a moment with her face that she didn't want witnessed. She stopped at the corner where Callaway Road met the main street and waited without turning until she heard his footsteps join hers. They walked together in silence, and the silence was different from before. Cracked open, the air moving through it. What comes next? She said finally. Practical. Necessary. The part of her that kept moving because stopping was the thing that broke people. The rogues will return, he said, in larger numbers, before the lunar cycle ends. How long do we have? 5 days. She nodded. Breathed. Let the cold air do its work. Then we have 5 days, she said, to figure out how to keep something ancient from getting loose, together. She glanced at him sideways, just briefly. And Kale, no more withheld things. Whatever you know that concerns me, I hear it. All of it. Agreed, he looked at her, and something in his face and the careful silver eyes that had been holding her at a managed distance for longer than she'd known shifted into a new configuration, one that looked, faintly, like the beginning of trust. Agreed, he said. Chapter 8. Everything at once. The next 3 days were the closest thing to a life Lena had ever lived. She wasn't sure how else to name it. She had existed before, had moved through days and shifts and silences and the careful choreography of her mother's house. But existing and living were different in the way that a photograph of a fire and an actual fire were different. One you could hold at a safe distance, one you could not. Cale came to the library on the first day. He sat across the table from her in the local history section with the old journals spread between them, and they worked through everything. Every account, every symbol description, every recorded interaction between the Voss line and the Greywood pack, and he filled the gaps the documents left with his own memory, which was vast and precise and occasionally devastating in its detail. He had known Aldrich Voss, her ancestor, had described him as a man of stubborn patience and terrible handwriting who had taken the bond's demands seriously and discharged them with the sober practicality of a farmer tending a difficult crop. He had known the women before and after Aldrich, the Morkai of each generation, each one different, each one arriving at the bond from a different angle of understanding. None of them chose it without fear, he said, on the second day, sitting on the floor of the stone house's front room with a hand-drawn map of the Greywood's boundary between them. That's something people get wrong about courage. They think it requires the absence of fear. What does it require? She asked. He looked at the map, deciding that the thing you're afraid of matters less than the thing you're protecting. She thought about this for a long time. On the second day, he also showed her the full scope of the deterioration, walked her along the Greywood's boundary in the gray afternoon, pointing out the places where the symbols on the border trees had gone cold, their luminescence faded, the warmth absent when she pressed her palm to them. These were the gaps, the places where the binding had worn through entirely. There were more of them than she expected. Here, he said at a gap near the town's eastern edge, is where they crossed 2 nights ago. She looked at the cold, dark tree, at the symbol that had gone silent and inert on its surface. She put her hand on it and felt nothing, not cold exactly, not hostile, just absence. The particular grief of something that should be warm and isn't. When I acknowledge the bond, she said, the formal acknowledgement. What happens to these? They reactivate, he said, the whole boundary, all at once. He paused. like a current being restored. And what does the acknowledgement require? He was quiet for a moment. They were standing very close. The boundary was narrow, the trees dense here, and the space between them had been gradually, almost imperceptibly, reducing over 3 days in the way that distance reduces between two people who keep choosing to be in the same room. Your full awareness, your spoken consent, and contact with the primary binding site. Where is it? The center of the gray wood. He looked at her steadily. The original tree, where the first bond was made. She nodded, filed it, moved on in the practical way she had learned to move through necessary things. But she felt his eyes on the side of her face and felt the hum between them, which had been steadily clarifying over 3 days from a frequency she couldn't name into something almost like a language, and she knew he was aware of the same thing she was. That they were running out of days, and the gap between where they stood now and what the bond required was closing. And neither of them had said anything direct about what was happening between them that wasn't the bond, that wasn't ancient obligation. That was simply two people who had been standing at the edge of each other's gravity for weeks and were no longer successfully pretending otherwise. On the third evening, she told him about her mother. Not the version she had carried in compressed form for years, the efficient summary, the minimum necessary disclosure. She told him the actual version, the specific weight of specific mornings, the choreography she had spent her childhood perfecting, the bruise on her collarbone that was now faded to yellow, that had come from a hand she loved because it was the only hand available to love. He listened without interrupting, without offering the reflexive condolences people offered when they wanted to close the subject. He listened the way people listen when they intend to carry what you give them, and when she finished he said nothing for a long time, which was the exactly right response, and then he said, "You learned to make yourself small in order to survive something that should never have asked that of you." She looked at the fire he had made in the stone house's hearth, which threw warm light across the bare room and made it look, for the first time, like somewhere a person might choose to be. "Yes," she said. "You are not small," he said. Not gently, not with the softness of reassurance. The way you state a structural fact about a load-bearing wall, you never were. The smallness was a strategy. It was never the truth of you. She kept her eyes on the fire. The hum in her chest was very present. "I know," she said quietly. "I'm beginning to remember that. The attack came on the 4th night. Not at the Greywood border. Not at the gaps in the boundary where she would have expected it. At her house, she was alone. Her mother had gone to bed early, unusual, the wine having done its work before 9, when she heard it. Not the sound of approach, not footsteps, or the creak of the gate. Something more primitive than sound. A pressure in the air. A sudden dropping of temperature in the room that had no meteorological explanation. And the hum in her chest screaming from warmth into alarm in the span of a single heartbeat. She was at the window before she knew she'd moved. 3 shapes at the edge of the property, where the grass gave way to the thin stand of birches that lined the back of the lot. Not wolves. Or not only wolves. She had the impression of forms that shifted between states, that couldn't quite commit to one shape, that existed in the threshold between. Her phone was in her hand. She had Cale's number, one of the practical arrangements of the past 3 days. He answered before the first ring completed. "They're here," she said. Her voice was steady. "My house, 3 of them. Back property line." Silence on the line that wasn't absence. She could hear him moving. Could feel through the bond's frequency the spike of something cold and focused and ancient. "Get your mother," he said. "Ground floor, interior room, no windows, do it now." "How long?" 3 minutes. "Lena." His voice dropped into something that was command and something else simultaneously. "Trust me." She was already moving up the stairs. Her mother woke confused and resistant, sleep and wine making her slow, her face arranging itself toward the argument that was her default response to being woken. Lena didn't give her the time. "Get up," she said. "Now, interior room. I'll explain after." Something in Lena's voice, the quality of it, stripped of the careful modulation she usually maintained in this house, made her mother look at her differently. Made her sit up. "Lena, now Mom." They were in the hallway bathroom. No windows, interior walls, when the sound came from the back of the house. The door to the kitchen which she had locked, giving way. Not with the violence of being forced, but with the quiet, deliberate sound of something that didn't need force. Something that simply decided the lock was a suggestion. Her mother was breathing too fast beside her. She reached out without thinking and took her mother's hand, And her mother, 20 years of damage and withheld things and the long, terrible history of the house they were sitting in, held on. The temperature in the hallway dropped. And then, from outside the front of the house, a sound she recognized. Not the warning vocalization from the forest, something beyond that, a sound with authority in it older than language, older than the town, older than the century-long journals in the library. A sound that moved through the walls of the house and into her chest and wrapped around the hum and steadied it and said, in the only language the ancient things understood, "This is mine. She is mine. You will not." Then collision. Impact against the back of the house. Movement, fast and enormous, sweeping around the property. The sounds of something brief and conclusive. Then silence. Then his voice, outside the front door, "It's over. You can come out." She opened the bathroom door, walked to the front of the house, opened the door. He was standing on the front step with his coat in his hand and his pale eyes finding hers immediately. Not checking for injury first, she noticed. Finding her eyes first, the way you find a fixed point when the ground has been moving. Behind her, her mother made a small sound. Lena turned. Her mother was standing in the hallway looking at Cale, looking at him with an expression Lena had never seen on her mother's face before. Not fear. Not anger. Something older than both. Recognition. "You," her mother said. Her voice had gone completely flat. "Clara," he said. He said it simply, without accusation, the way you say the name of something you have been carrying for a long time. In the silence that followed, in the hallway of the house with everything cracked open and the hum in Lena's chest resonant and awake, the last withheld thing revealed its shape at last. Her mother had not simply known about the bond. Her mother had met him before. Chapter 9. The thing that was always true. Her mother sat at the kitchen table with both hands wrapped around a mug of tea she hadn't touched and told the truth for the first time in 20 years. It came out in pieces. The way long-held things come out, not in the clean linear narrative of someone who has rehearsed disclosure but in fragments that arrived out of sequence and had to be assembled. Lena sitting across from her and Cale standing in the doorway with his arms folded and his face holding the particular patience of someone who has already waited 2 decades and can manage a little longer. Her mother had been 24 when Cale first came to her. The bond had activated on her birthday, the same way it always activated in the Voss line, a sudden warmth, a hum, a pull toward the gray wood that she'd followed 3 nights in a row before understanding what she was being drawn toward. He had found her at the border the way he had found Lena on Callaway Road, with that same absolute stillness, those same pale eyes. She had been afraid, not of him exactly. She had been clear on this point, pressing it as though she needed Lena to understand the distinction, not of him, of what acknowledging the bond would mean, of stepping into a world with ancient obligations and supernatural stakes and a role she had not chosen and could not fully comprehend, of the permanence of it, of belonging irrevocably to something larger than herself. "I ran," her mother said simply. She had moved them away for 2 years, Lena's grandmother Lena, not yet born, convinced that distance would dissolve the bond. It hadn't. They came back because her own mother was ill and the bond came back with them, stronger for the absence, and Cale returned to the border and her mother refused him again. "And then you had me," Lena said. Her mother looked at the untouched tea. "And then I had you. And you knew what I would be." The silence that followed was the longest one yet. "I tried to protect you from it," her mother said. The sentence had the quality of something believed deeply and broken entirely. "I thought if you didn't know, I would be safe," Lena said. "Yes, but I wasn't safe." She said it without heat, stating the structural fact of it. Not knowing didn't protect me. It just meant I was carrying it without any of the context that would have made it make sense. Her mother's hands tightened around the mug. Lena watched her face, that face she had been reading for survival since childhood, every micro-expression catalogued and filed, and saw something she had rarely seen there. Something that sat at the bottom of all the drinking and the damage and the long terrible architecture of their shared life. Grief. The pure, uncomplicated kind. The kind that comes from understanding, too late, what a choice has cost. "I know," her mother said. Very quietly. "I know." Lena sat with this. Let it be what it was, without making it larger or smaller. There would be more to say, she knew, more to untangle in the long patient work that lay ahead of them, if they got through what was coming. But not tonight. Tonight she had taken in enough of the shape of things. Tonight she needed to focus on what remained. She looked at Kale in the doorway. "One day left," she said. "Yes." She stood. "Then we need to talk about the center of the Greywood." They left her mother at the house. She had wept quietly while Lena got her coat, the first tears Lena had witnessed from her in years. And Lena had stood in the hallway for a moment and then done something she hadn't done since she was a small child and pressed her forehead briefly against her mother's temple, and her mother had made a sound that was barely audible and held on. And then Lena walked out the front door with Kale and into the cold night and breathed the clean air and let the hum in her chest orient her like a compass finding north. They walked toward the Greywood without discussing it. The town was quiet around them, amber lights on empty streets, the whole sleeping world unaware of the boundary holding it safe and the single day remaining before it failed entirely. At the tree line, he stopped. She stopped beside him. Their breath made small clouds in the still air. "Tell me what the acknowledgement actually involves," she said, specifically, not the broad version. He turned to look at her. "You stand at the original tree. You speak your name and your lineage, the Voss women, as far back as you know. You place both hands on the primary symbol." He paused. "And you choose, consciously, explicitly, without ambiguity. The bond doesn't accept reluctant participants. And then, the boundary reactivates, the binding renews." He was looking at her steadily. "And you and I are," he stopped. "Connected," she said. "More than connected," his voice was careful. "The Morkai bond isn't passive. It doesn't sit quietly in the background, it is a living thing. You will feel the pack, you will feel the boundary. You will feel." He stopped again. "You," she said. The word settled between them in the cold, still air. "Yes," he said. She looked at the Greywood before them, the dark trees, the faint silver luminescence of the symbols, the low resonance of the fraying binding audible now even in the open air. She thought about the word choice and what it required. She thought about her mother at 24, standing at the same edge and stepping back from it, and all the years of consequence that had flowed from that single retreat. She thought about her hand on his brow in the forest, and the warmth that had moved through her like a door opening. She looked at Kale beside her, this ancient, careful, devastatingly patient being who had felt her worst moments through a fraying thread for 12 years, and pushed whatever warmth he could manage back through it, and called this inadequate and meant it, and understood that the thing happening between them was not only the bond's work. The bond had introduced them, had placed them in each other's orbit, but the rest of it, the 3 days in the library, the map on the floor, the fire in the empty room, him saying you are not small with the conviction of someone stating a load-bearing fact. That was something the ancient ritual had not scripted. That was just them. "I'm not afraid," she said. "I know," he said. "That's the part that..." He stopped himself. "Say it," she said. He looked at her. In the Greywood's silver light, his pale eyes were luminous and unguarded, and all the careful architecture of his distance had been standing in the cold night air for 3 days, and was no longer fully operational, and she was glad. "That's the part that undoes me," he said quietly. "You have every reason to run. You were handed this without your consent. Your entire life was shaped by it. Without your knowledge. And you were standing here at the edge of it, choosing it anyway." Something moved through his expression that was not controlled and not composed, and was entirely, nakedly itself. "I have been doing this for a very long time, Lena. I have watched generations of women make this choice. I have never..." He stopped. "Never what?" she said. "Never felt what I feel when I look at you," he said. "Simply, irreversibly. That is not the bond. I know what the bond feels like. That is something else." She held his gaze in the cold silver light and felt the hum in her chest rise and clarify, and she thought, there it is, the thing that had been building since a wolf stood motionless on a road in November and looked at her like she was a question he had been waiting a very long time to ask. She crossed the distance between them, not all of it. She stopped close enough that the warmth radiating from him reached her, that remarkable heat, and looked up at his face, which had gone entirely still in a new way. Not the stillness of control, but the stillness of something that has stopped pretending. "I've been making myself small my whole life," she said. "I'm done with that." She held his gaze. "Whatever this is, the bond, the other thing, all of it, I want it. I'm choosing it. A beat. I'm choosing you. He looked at her for one long suspended moment, and then he raised his hand and placed it very carefully against the side of her face, and she turned into it the way you turn toward. Warmth that you have been cold without for longer than you knew. He pressed his forehead to hers. That was all. No urgency in it, no rush. Just the weight of contact between two people who had been at the edge of each other's gravity for weeks and had finally stopped performing the pretense of standing elsewhere. The hum between them settled into something she could only describe as resolved, a frequency that had been searching for its match and found it. "I've been waiting for you," he said against her hair, not romantically precisely, or not only, with the weight of something true and very old. "For a long time." "I know," she said. "I'm here now." Above them the grey wood breezed its silver light upward through the roots, and the symbols on the border trees pulsed once, in unison, as though registering the approach of something they had been built to hold space for. One day remained. Whatever came tomorrow, she would walk into it from this side of this moment, and this side of this moment was entirely different from anywhere she had stood before. She was the size she actually was, and she was not going to be made smaller again. Chapter 10. The last night of the old world. The day of the lunar cycle's end arrived the way final things sometimes do, quietly, without ceremony. The sky a pale unmarked gray that gave nothing away about what it intended. Lena woke early. Lay in the dark of her room with the hum in her chest steady and oriented, like a compass that had finally stopped spinning, and listened to the house around her. Her mother was asleep down the hall. The street outside was silent. The grey wood was not visible from her window, but she felt its direction, with the same automatic certainty she felt the direction of her own heartbeat. She got up, made coffee, stood at the kitchen window and watched the grey morning assemble itself over the rooftops, and thought about all the women who had stood at the edge of this day before her, the ones who had stepped forward, the ones who had stepped back, the accumulated weight of 7 generations of choices, all converging in this kitchen, this window, this particular grey morning. Her mother came downstairs at 7. They sat across from each other with their coffee, and the silence between them was different from every silence they had shared in this kitchen before. Cracked open, the cold air moving through it, the long architecture of withheld things no longer standing. "Tonight," her mother said. "Yes." Her mother looked at her coffee. "The last time I stood at the border," she stopped, started again. "I felt it, the pull, the warmth in the symbols." She looked up. "I knew what it was asking of me, and I turned away." "I know," Lena said. "I told myself it was for you." Her mother's voice was quiet and unflinching in the way of someone delivering a verdict on themselves. "That I was protecting you." "But I think," she paused, "I think I was protecting myself from belonging to something I couldn't control." Lena held her coffee mug and looked at her mother, really looked, the way she had stopped allowing herself years ago because looking directly at the source of your pain required a stability she hadn't trusted herself to maintain. She saw a woman who had been given something enormous and ancient and had not been strong enough to carry it, and had passed the weight of her refusal onto her daughter without meaning to, and had spent 20 years drinking around the knowledge of it. She saw someone who needed forgiveness more than she deserved it, and who was going to receive it anyway, because Lena was done making herself small and small people withheld things and she was not that anymore. "I'm not angry," Lena said. She meant it fully and she meant it in full knowledge of everything it cost. "Not anymore." Her mother pressed her lips together, nodded once. Something in her face shifted into a new configuration, older and lighter simultaneously. "Be careful tonight," her mother said. "And Lena," she looked up, "don't step back." Cale came at dusk. He knocked on the front door, which she found inexplicably moving. This ancient Alpha King who had walked through locked doors and forest ambushes, knocking politely on a weatherboard door in a small town. She opened it and looked at him in the last of the day's light and felt the hum rise and clarify. "Ready," he said. "Yes." Behind her, her mother stood in the hallway. Cale looked at her and something passed between them. Not warmth exactly, not reconciliation, but acknowledgement. The nod of two people who had been on opposite sides of a long stalemate and had both lived with the consequences. Her mother nodded back. Lena walked out into the dark. They felt the rogues before they reached the grey wood. 3 blocks from the tree line the air changed. A pressure drop, a cold that was not meteorological. The same quality of wrongness she had felt in her house 4 nights ago, but amplified, multiplied. Not 3 shapes this time. Keel stopped walking. His head came up. His pale eyes swept the dark street ahead. "How many?" she asked. "7, he said. "Maybe 8. His voice had gone very quiet and very flat. Full assault. The cold was spreading. Somewhere ahead, at the tree line's edge, she heard the first sound. Not the sharp percussive movement of the other night, but something lower, something with patience in it. The sound of things that had been waiting a long time and had decided waiting was finished. "The primary binding site," she said. "How far inside the Greywood?" "Quarter mile. There's a clearing." He looked at her. "If we can reach it." "We reach it," she said. He looked at her for one moment, pale eyes steady, carrying something she had come to recognize as the specific form his affection took. Direct and undecorated and entirely serious. And then he said, "Stay close to me. Don't stop moving, regardless of what you hear. The center of the Greywood is pack territory. Even degraded the binding gives my form more strength there." "Understood, Lena." He said her name the way he always said it, like a word he had been given and intended to take care of. "Whatever happens in that clearing, you complete the acknowledgement. The pack, the boundary, the sealed territory, all of it depends on you finishing it. And you? Don't worry about me." "Kale." "Don't worry about me," he said again. Then quieter, "I have been doing this a very long time. Trust me." She looked at him. Decided. "Come back," she said simply. Something moved through his expression that was not controlled and not composed. "Yes," he said. Then the first shape broke from the shadows at the street's edge, and there was no more time for words. He shifted mid-stride. That fluid, breathtaking transition between states, and the wolf surged forward to meet the first attacker before it reached the open ground, and Lena was already running for the tree line. The Greywood took her in. The forest was different tonight, charged. Every symbol on every tree blazing silver-white, frantic, the fading binding making its last effort to hold. The light of them illuminated the path before her, and she ran by it, vaulting roots, ducking low branches, the quarter mile to the clearing feeling simultaneously endless and immediate. Behind and around her the forest was full of sound, impacts, the deep, resonant authority of Kale's voice, cutting through the chaos in commands she felt more than heard, and beneath it all a fraying binding screaming its frequency into the ground and up through her feet like something pleading. A shape dropped from the shadows to her left. She didn't stop. She changed direction, used the tree beside her as a brace, shoved off from it, kept moving. It wasn't courage. It was the clarity of someone who has spent a lifetime moving through dangerous spaces and knows that hesitation is the thing that costs you. The clearing opened before her. She came through the tree line and stopped, because she had to. The sight of it was physically arresting. A circle of ancient oaks, their trunks enormous, every surface blazing with symbols whose light had gone from silver to white to something beyond color, something that was closer to pure frequency than light. And at the center, the tree, the original, wider than 3 of her could have embraced, its bark so densely covered in overlapping circles that the symbols had merged into a continuous pattern, a skin of ancient intention covering the entire trunk. At its base, the ground was warm. She could feel it through her boots. She walked to it. Behind her, the sounds of the forest were reaching their crescendo. Everything happening at once. Multiple engagements. The old pack law and the rogue challenge and the fraying boundary all colliding in the dark outside this clearing. And she planted her feet on the warm ground and raised both hands and pressed them, flat against the ancient trunk. The warmth moved through her. Not the gentle, layered warmth she had felt at the border trees. This was the source. The original. It moved through her hands and up her arms and into her chest where the hum lived, and the hum answered it. Not the searching, uncertain frequency she had been carrying for weeks, but the full, clarified version, recognizing its own origin, a bell finally being struck with the hammer it was cast for. She felt everything simultaneously. The boundary, all of it, the entire perimeter of the Greywood, like a vast interrupted circle, suddenly present to her awareness. The gaps, cold and silent, and the intact sections, warm and humming, and the whole enormous living system of it waiting, breath held. She felt the pack. Kale's presence, that cold, focused ancient thing, fighting at 3 points simultaneously with an efficiency that was not human and was entirely his. She felt her own name. "I am Lena Voss," she said. Her voice came out clear and steady in the silent clearing. "Daughter of Clara Voss." granddaughter of Margaret Voss. Of the Voss line, 7 generations, this place and this bond and this boundary. The tree pulsed beneath her hands. I know what this is, she said. I know what it asks of me. I am not afraid and I am not reluctant, and I am not making this choice because I have no others. Her voice dropped but didn't waver. I am making it because it is true, because I am the thread and I know it now and I am choosing to hold. She pressed both palms harder against the bark. I acknowledged the bond. The boundary ignited. She felt it travel instantaneous, the current restored, racing the full perimeter of the gray wood at a speed that had no physical analog, every cold and silent symbol blazing back to life in a single cascading wave. The gaps sealed, the fraying frequency resolved. The ancient sealed thing at the graywood's deepest center met the renewed boundary and fell back, contained, the lock rekeyed and holding. In the forest outside the clearing, the sounds of fighting stopped, not gradually, all at once. She stood with her hands on the primary tree and felt the boundary hum through her like a second heartbeat, steady and deep, and felt, through the bond's newly clarified frequency, Hale's presence, not fighting now. Still, standing somewhere in the dark forest, alive and intact and oriented, she knew without seeing, toward her. The clearing was very bright, every symbol on every oak blazing, full in silver. The original tree beneath her hands radiating warmth that was not heat precisely, but something warmth was the closest word for, the warmth of something old and important that has been restored to its proper function and is, in whatever way ancient things are capable of it, grateful. She lowered her hands. She turned. He came through the tree line and crossed the clearing and stopped in front of her, and they looked at each other in the blazing silver light, with the boundary humming its steady, renewed frequency. The ground and the sealed thing settled back into its containment, and the rogue pack dispersed into the wider dark beyond the graywood's edge. He was unhurt. She checked, visually and through the bond which was clear as water now and gave her his state directly, and he was unhurt. Done, she said. Done, he said. Done, he said. His voice carried something she had been hearing its approach towards since Calloway Road, since the library, since the floor of the stone house with the map between them, something that had arrived at last at its full expression. She stepped forward into the warmth that radiated from him, and he put his arms around her in the silver blazing clearing and held her with the particular care of someone who knows the precise weight of what they are holding, and the boundary hummed its ancient frequency through the earth beneath their feet, and the graywood breathed around them, steady and full and finally, completely restored. Chapter 11. The morning after the old world ends. She walked home through the gray wood, not the border path, not the careful peripheral route she had used every other time. Through it. The long way, the deep way. The way that took her past the original tree and through the full heart of the forest and out the far northern edge where the gray wood met the back of the old Mill Haven cemetery and the town resumed its ordinary life on the other side of a stone wall. Cale walked beside her. The forest at night, with the binding fully restored, was entirely different from the forest she had been navigating for the past week. The frantic quality was gone, the blazing urgency of the symbols, the high-strained frequency of something failing. What remained was quieter and deeper. The symbols on the trees glowed with a steady silver warmth, not frantic but permanent, the light of something that has been doing its work for centuries and intends to continue. The ground was warm beneath the frozen surface. The trees moved in a wind she couldn't feel on her skin, as though responding to a frequency below the range of human sensation. She felt the boundary as a continuous presence at the edge of her awareness, not intrusive, not demanding. Like knowing where your hands are, a peripheral certainty that had simply become part of how she inhabited herself. Will it always feel like this? She asked. Like what? Present. The boundary. The bond, she considered. Like a second heartbeat. He was quiet for a moment, walking beside her through the silver-lit dark. For the first few months, it will be more pronounced. You'll learn to modulate it, to bring it forward when you need it, let it recede when you don't. He glanced at her. Your predecessors described it differently. One called it a compass. One called it a conversation that never ends. Which do you think it is? Both, he said. Depending on the day. She thought about this. The trees moved in their unfelt wind. Somewhere deeper in the graywood, something called, not the sharp, threatening sounds of the past week, but something low and settled, the sound of a territory at rest. The pack, she said, Will I meet them? Yes, when you're ready. He paused. They know what happened tonight. They felt the boundary reactivate. Something that might have been warmth moved through his voice. There are 3 who have been waiting decades for this night. They're relieved. They're ecstatic, he said, with a dryness she had come to recognize as the way he expressed things that genuinely moved him. They've been living with a deteriorating boundary for 20 years. They will be demonstrative. She smiled. The first uncomplicated smile she'd managed in a week. Are they? Large. Yes. Louder than necessary. Deeply convinced that their opinions about everything are required by the situation. He looked at her sideways. You'll manage them fine. She believed him. That was the part that surprised her most. Not the bond, not the boundary. Not even the fact of what she had become tonight in that clearing, with both hands on the oldest tree, in a forest that predated the country it sat in. The thing that surprised her most was the unqualified nature of her own belief. In him. In this. In herself. She had spent 23 years calibrating her trust to the minimum survivable dose, giving the smallest necessary amount to the smallest safe target, keeping the reserves locked where damage couldn't reach them. The reserves were not locked anymore. This felt, she decided, exactly as frightening and exactly as necessary as she had always known. On some level, in the part of her that had been oriented toward this her entire life without her knowledge, it would. They came out of the Greywood's northern edge as the clock turned toward 2 in the morning. The cemetery on the other side of the stone wall was quiet and frost-pale, the old headstones standing in their patient rows, and beyond it the town resumed. Streetlights, parked cars, a dog barking once and falling silent. She stalked at the wall and looked back at the tree line. From outside, with the binding restored, the Greywood looked the same as it always had from the town's perspective. Dark. Dense. The kind of forest that discouraged approach. But she could feel, through the boundary's steady pulse, the warmth of it, the living system of it, the ancient compact between this land and the people who had agreed to tend it. And she understood that she would never be able to look at it again the way she had looked at it before. She wasn't sure she wanted to. What happens now, she said, practically, tomorrow. Tomorrow is ordinary, he said. You go to the diner. You work the shift. The boundary holds. He looked at her steadily. Being the Morkai isn't a full-time occupation. It doesn't replace your life. It coexists with it. And you? A pause. I stay, he said. Simply. She looked at him. You've been staying in that house temporarily. I'll make other arrangements. In Millhaven, he confirmed, with the careful neutrality of someone placing a card on the table and waiting to see what the other player does with it. She looked at the frost-pale cemetery in the quiet town beyond it and thought about the diner and the library and the small life she had built inside a larger life that had been withholding itself from her. She thought about the stone house on Birchwood Close with its sparse rooms and its single mug on the counter, and the fire he had made in the hearth that had made the room look, for the first time, like somewhere a person might choose to be. There's a house on Calloway Road, she said, end of the street, near the boundary. It's been empty for 2 years. The landlord keeps renewing the listing. He looked at her. It has 2 floors, she said, and a view of the tree line. She met his eyes. And it's big enough for arrangements. The expression that moved through his face was not controlled and it was not composed, and it was entirely, quietly extraordinary. I'll look at it tomorrow, he said. Good. She let herself into her house at 2:30. The lights were off except for the small lamp her mother left on in the hallway. A habit from Lena's childhood that had never stopped, the one consistent domestic tenderness in a house full of inconsistencies. She stood in its amber light and felt the house differently than she had felt it this morning. Not smaller exactly, just honestly sized. A place where difficult things had happened, and where, perhaps, other things might happen now. The house was not the story. It was just the place the story had been set. She went upstairs, paused at her mother's door, which was slightly ajar the way it always was. A habit from when Lena was small and her mother had wanted to hear if she needed something in the night. Before the drinking made the hearing unreliable, before the wanting became complicated. Before everything, through the gap, she could see her mother asleep. The lines of her face relaxed in sleep into something younger than she looked awake. Some version of herself that predated the 20 years of consequence. Lena looked at her for a moment. I chose forward, she said quietly. Too quiet to wake her, just needed to say it. She went to her room. lay on her bed with the lamp off and the gray wood's direction steady at the edge of her awareness, and the boundary humming its low, warm frequency through the earth and into the bed frame and into her bones, and felt, for the first time, in the specific location of her own body, in her own bed, in the room she had slept in for 23 years, that she was not temporary here, not passing through, not waiting to be displaced, not making herself small enough to avoid becoming a reason. She was exactly where she was supposed to be. The hum in her chest, which had begun as a frequency she couldn't name on a cold road in November, which had built through libraries and stone floors and ancient forests and declarations in silver-lit clearings, settled now into the simplest version of itself, not searching, not fraying, not afraid, just present, just hers, just real. Outside her window, the gray wood stood at the edge of Millhaven in the dark, its boundary alive and restored, its symbols warm on the old bark. Its sealed thing settled back into its ancient containment, where it would stay as long as the thread held. The thread held. She closed her eyes. Somewhere, on Birchwood Close, in a spare house with a single mug on the counter, an ancient thing that had been waiting a very long time was also, at last, at rest. She slept without dreaming. Or perhaps she dreamed only of this, the warmth, the steady hum, the particular quality of a life that had finally fully opened to its own size. Either way, when morning came gray and ordinary through her window, she woke facing it, without flinching, ready,